The copper-scented grime beneath your fingernails never washes out on the first scrub. You learn to live with the rusted stains, just like you learn to live with the choices that put them there. She didn't come to him looking for a hero. Heroes die young, gasping their last breaths on wet pavement over misplaced ideals. She came looking for a monster big enough to scare away the devils chasing her. And when she begged him to keep her, the devil didn't smile. He just stood up. Rain lashed against the frosted glass of the skylight, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown by an angry child. Sadie dragged her boots across the threshold, her breathing ragged, tearing at her throat like swallowed glass. She smelled of wet wool copper and the sharp, sour tang of adrenaline. Every muscle in her body screamed a choir of bruised tissue and overextended joints, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. The heavy oak doors of the back room had closed behind her, muting the heavy, thumping bass from the club upstairs, leaving only the sound of her own frantic gasps and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Ricky sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single slab of midnight. He didn't look up. His pen continued its smooth, unbroken glide across a ledger. The only indication that he even knew she was there was the slight pause in the rotation of the ice cubes in the tumbler of scotch resting near his elbow. He wore a charcoal suit, the jacket discarded over the back of his chair sleeves, rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and pale intersecting scars. He looked entirely ordinary in his violence. There was no theatrical menace, just the heavy, suffocating gravity of a man who decided who lived and who died before he had his morning coffee. Sadie's left knee gave out. She didn't fall gracefully. She hit the Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud, biting her lip hard enough to taste copper just to keep from crying out. The rug felt thick, expensive, and wholly inappropriate for the mud she was bleeding into it. "You're tracking gutter water into my office," Ricky murmured. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges, like tires on loose gravel. He finally stopped writing. He didn't cap the pen. He just let it rest. "They're right behind me," Sadie choked out. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was thin, reedy, stripped of all the sarcastic armor she usually wore to survive the city. "I know." He didn't seem to care. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He reached for his glass, taking a slow, measured sip. The smell of peat and smoke drifted across the room, mixing sickeningly with the metallic scent of her own blood. Footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Heavy, deliberate. The unmistakable sound of Victor's enforcers. They wore steel-toed boots, a crude intimidation tactic that usually worked. The brass doorknob rattled, panic cold and sharp as a butcher's knife twisted in Sadie's gut. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, dignity entirely abandoned. Her fingers clamped onto the edge of Ricky's desk, her knuckles white, her nails digging into the polished mahogany. She looked up at him. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, devoid of pity, devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a predator analyzing a wounded bird, calculating the caloric value versus the effort of the kill. The door began to inch open, the heavy hinges whining. Sadie leaned in, her voice, breaking, dropping to a fractured, desperate whisper that barely carried over the rain. "Please, please don't let him take me." Ricky stared down at her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands, at the desperate, white-knuckled grip she had on his property. Then he looked at the door. Victor stood in the frame. He was a man who tried too hard to look like money, wearing a silk suit that caught the dim light in a way that screamed cheap. He smelled aggressively of synthetic cologne, a sweet, rotting fruit scent that immediately overpowered the scotch and the rain. Behind him stood two men, built like brick walls, and just as intelligent. "Ricky." Victor said, his voice slick, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Sorry to interrupt the accounting. The girl belongs to me. She stole something. I'm just here to collect." Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. Her lungs refused to take in air. This was it. She had played her last card, and she had played it at the wrong table. Ricky was a businessman. Victor was a businessman. They would trade her life for a favor, a route, a shipment of weapons. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a piano wire about to snap. Ricky set his glass down. The clink of crystal against wood was deafening in the quiet room. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even look angry. Ricky placed his hands flat on the desk. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up. He was taller than he looked, sitting down, a towering, broad-shouldered silhouette against the dim lamplight. He buttoned his vest, his movements relaxed, almost bored. He finally shifted his gaze to Victor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Try," Ricky said. One word, flat, hollow, final. Victor's greasy smile didn't entirely vanish, but it froze, turning brittle at the edges. He hadn't expected friction. He shifted his weight, his expensive polished leather shoes squeaking faintly against the hardwood border of the room. It was a tiny sound, but in the suffocating quiet it sounded like a scream. "Come on, Ricky." Victor chuckled. It was a wet, nervous sound. "Let's not make this a thing. She's a nobody, a street rat who got her hands in the wrong pockets. You don't even know her." "I don't?" Ricky agreed. His voice remained perfectly level. He stepped around the desk. His gait was slow, predatory. He stopped between Sadie, who was still kneeling on the rug, and the doorway. He didn't look down at her. He kept his eyes locked on Victor. "But she is bleeding on my rug, and you tracked your cheap cologne into my airspace without an invitation." "Are you serious?" Victor took a half-step forward, his bravado returning. He nodded to the two massive enforcers flanking him. "You're going to start a war with my family over a thief." Sadie opened her eyes, peering through the tangled, wet strands of her hair. She watched the back of Ricky's legs. He stood completely still. There was no trembling, no shifting of weight. He was an immovable object. She felt a sickening wave of contradiction wash over her. She was terrified of the men at the door, but the man standing between her and them was a walking void. She hadn't found safety. She had just found a larger predator to hide behind. "I'm not starting a war, Victor," Ricky said softly. "I'm telling you to leave. And if I don't..." From the shadows of the room, a corner Sadie hadn't even realized was occupied, a figure moved. A man stepped forward into the dim periphery of the desk lamp. He was lean-dressed entirely in black, holding a suppressed pistol with a casual familiarity that made Sadie's stomach turn over. "Then Collins will shoot your right kneecap off," Ricky stated, as if commenting on the weather. "And then I will have the cleaners roll you in this rug and drop you in the harbor. I've been meaning to replace it anyway. The pattern is too busy." Victor's eyes darted to Collins, then back to Ricky. The muscles in his jaw ticked. He was calculating the odds. 3 against 2, but they were in Ricky's territory. Victor might get a shot off, but he wouldn't leave the room alive. His ego fought a brief, violent war with his survival instinct. "She owes me..." Victor spat, the slick veneer entirely gone, replaced by raw, ugly anger. 300 grand. You keep her, you buy her debt. Fine." Ricky didn't blink. Victor hesitated. He clearly wanted to say more to salvage some scrap of dignity, but the dead, flat stare of the man in front of him offered no purchase. Ricky wasn't playing a game. He simply didn't care if Victor lived or died, and that absolute indifference was more terrifying than any threat. "You're going to regret this, Ricky. She's a curse." Victor took a step back, gesturing sharply to his men. They backed out slowly. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The silence crashed back into the room, heavier than before. Sadie stayed on the floor. Her breath hitched. The adrenaline was rapidly leaving her system, leaving behind a cold, shivering void. Her hands were shaking violently now. Ricky stood facing the door for a long 10 seconds. Then he let out a slow, quiet exhale and turned around. He looked down at her. "Get up," he said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't gentle. It was a command issued to a stray dog he had just let inside out of the rain. Sadie tried. She placed her hands on the floor and pushed, but her left leg flared in agony, a sharp, white-hot stabbing pain that stole her breath. She collapsed back onto her hip, gasping. Ricky watched her struggle for a moment. His expression didn't soften. He reached down, grabbing her by the bicep. His grip was entirely devoid of intimacy. It was the grip of a mechanic lifting a heavy engine part. He hoisted her to her feet in one smooth motion. Sadie swayed her head, spinning. She instinctively grabbed the lapel of his vest to steady herself. The fabric was rough-smelling faintly of tobacco and expensive soap. She looked up into his face. Up close, she could see the dark bags under his eyes, the faint silver stubble along his jawline. He looked exhausted. He didn't pull away from her touch, but he didn't support her either. He just stood there, letting her hold herself up. $300,000. Ricky said quietly, his eyes boring into hers. That's what you just cost me. I didn't ask you to pay it. Sadie whispered, her voice trembling. No, you asked me to keep you alive. I bought the debt, which means as of right now, you belong to me until it's paid off. He reached up and peeled her fingers off his vest one by one. His touch was clinical. Collins, Ricky called out without turning around. Boss, the man in the shadows replied. Take her down the hall. Room 4. Get her a change of clothes and a bandage for that leg. Lock the door from the outside. I'm not a prisoner. Sadie protested, panic flaring again, hot and bright. Ricky finally smiled. It was a small, cruel thing that didn't reach his eyes. You just begged a monster for sanctuary. Did you really think the cage would be unlocked? Room 4 wasn't a dungeon, but it certainly wasn't a guest suite. It was a windowless square box with walls painted a sterile institutional grey. A single bulb in a caged fixture on the ceiling cast harsh, unforgiving shadows. The air in the room was stale, smelling faintly of bleach and old dust. A narrow cot sat against one wall, its mattress thin and covered by a scratchy military-issue wool blanket. In the corner, a small sink dripped with a rhythmic, maddening plink. Collins had shoved her inside, handed her a bundle of clean clothes, a pair of men's sweatpants, and an oversized black t-shirt, and a small first aid kit. The heavy metal door had slammed shut behind him, followed by the heavy metallic clank of a deadbolt sliding into place. Sadie stood in the center of the room, shivering violently. Her wet clothes clung to her like a second freezing skin. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing against her eardrums until they rang. She dropped the bundle of clothes onto the cot and stumbled toward the sink. She gripped the cold porcelain edges, staring at herself in the cracked mirror above it. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was sallow, her dark hair plastered to her skull in wet, filthy strings. A dark purple bruise was already blooming across her left cheekbone, and a streak of dried blood ran from her hairline down to her jaw. She turned on the faucet. The water sputtered, coughing out a rust-colored stream before clearing up. It was freezing. She splashed it onto her face anyway, gasping as the icy shock hit her skin. She grabbed a rough paper towel from a dispenser, scrubbing the grime and blood away with a desperate, punishing force. She hated herself right then. She hated the weakness in her knees, the tremor in her hands. She had survived on the streets of this rotting city by being invisible, by being smarter and faster than the thugs who thought they owned it. But she had gotten sloppy. She had stolen a drive from Victor's safe house, a drive she thought contained blackmail material she could sell to clear her brother's gambling debts. Instead, she had stolen Victor's offshore account ledgers. She hadn't just stepped on a snake, she had swallowed it whole. Now she traded a fast death in an alleyway for a slow, agonizing subjugation to Ricky. Sadie stripped off her wet clothes, letting them fall in a soggy, ruined pile on the linoleum floor. She dried herself with the thin towel Collins had provided, her teeth chattering. She pulled on the sweatpants. They were massive, swallowing her small frame, and she had to tie the drawstring tight to keep them up. The black t-shirt hung halfway down her thighs. It smelled of industrial laundry detergent, clean, but entirely devoid of human warmth. She dragged herself to the cot and sat down, opening the first aid kit. She rolled up the right leg of the sweatpants to inspect the damage. A jagged piece of metal from a fire escape had sliced deep into her calf during her run. It was ugly, the edges of the wound red and inflamed. She uncapped the bottle of iodine. The smell was sharp, medicinal, instantly triggering memories of hospital waiting rooms and bad news. She poured a generous amount onto a gauze pad and pressed it firmly against the cut. She didn't scream, but a harsh, ragged hiss escaped her teeth as the liquid fire bit into the open flesh. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away angrily. She wrapped the wound tightly with a bandage, pulling the tape tight. Finished, she pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. She stared at the blank grey wall opposite her. $300,000. She couldn't earn that in 3 lifetimes working legitimate jobs. Ricky knew that. He hadn't bought her debt expecting to be paid back in cash. He bought her because he found a use for her, or because he wanted leverage against Victor, or simply because he was a man who collected broken things to remind himself he wasn't one of them. The heavy lock on the door suddenly clicked a loud snapping sound that made Sadie jump. The door swung inward. Ricky stood in the doorway. He had removed the vest and tie. The top buttons of his white dress shirt were undone, revealing the edge of a dark tattoo snaking up his collarbone. He held 2 steaming ceramic mugs in his hands. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut with his heel. It didn't lock this time. He walked over and handed her one of the mugs. Sadie took it hesitantly. The ceramic was hot, immediately warming her freezing fingers. She looked down into the black, oily surface of the coffee. It smelled bitter and strong. Ricky didn't sit. He leaned against the wall next to the door, taking a slow sip from his own mug. His eyes scanned her, taking in the oversized clothes, the damp hair, the fresh bandage on her leg. "Drink," he ordered softly. "You're going into shock. The caffeine and the heat will help." "Are you poisoning me?" she asked. It was a stupid question born of exhaustion and a desperate need to say something defiant. Ricky snorted. It was a dark, humorless sound. "If I wanted you dead, Sadie, you would be floating in the harbor with Victor's apologies stuffed in your pockets. I don't waste good coffee on dead women." She took a sip. It burned her tongue, bitter and acidic, but the heat radiated down her throat and into her chest, pushing back the shivering cold for a brief moment. "How do you know my name?" she asked, looking up at him. "Victor never said it." "I know a lot of things," Ricky replied, crossing his ankles. "I know your name is Sadie. I know you're 26. I know you broke into Victor's safe house on 4th Street to steal what you thought was blackmail material. I know your brother is an idiot who owes 50 grand to the Russians. And I know you're currently trying to figure out how to escape this room the second I turn my back." Sadie gripped the mug tighter. "And what do you know about what I'm going to do to pay you back?" Ricky lowered his mug. He looked at her for a long time. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy with unspoken threats and complex calculations. He didn't look at her with lust or anger or pity. He looked at her like a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve or throw away. "You stole Victor's financial ledgers," Ricky finally said. "That means you have a memory for codes, or you're very good at picking digital locks. Either way, you have a specific set of skills." "I'm a thief," Sadie said flatly. "Not a spy. You're whatever I need you to be." Ricky corrected her, his voice devoid of malice but dripping with absolute authority. "Tomorrow you'll start working off your debt. You'll sit at a desk and you'll find every hidden account Victor has. You're going to dismantle his empire piece by piece from the inside of my servers. And if I refuse—" Ricky pushed himself off the wall. He walked over to the cot, stopping inches from where she sat. He leaned down. He smelled of that expensive soap tobacco and black coffee. His presence was overwhelming, a physical weight that made it hard for her to breathe. I bought you from the devil, Sadie. He whispered, his voice dark and smooth as velvet. If you refuse to work for me, I won't kill you. I'll just ask for a refund. He stood up, turning his back on her, and walked towards the door. Get some sleep, he said without looking back. You start at 6 a.m. Don't be late. The door closed behind him. The lock clicked heavily into place. Sadie sat alone in the stark light, the bitter coffee turning to ash in her mouth. She had survived the night, but as she stared at the locked door, she realized the worst part of making a deal with a monster wasn't the price. It was knowing that he always collected. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the harsh, snapping click of the deadbolt. Sadie hadn't slept. She had spent the last 6 hours tracing the cracks in the concrete ceiling, listening to the agonizingly slow drip of the corner sink. Her muscles were locked tight, cramped from the thin mattress and the lingering cold of the damp clothes she'd discarded on the floor. Collins stood in the doorway. He held a grey cardboard box and a fresh mug of whatever battery acid passed for coffee in this building. He didn't offer a greeting. He just nudged the door open wider with his boot. Get dressed. The boss is waiting. Sadie dragged herself upright. Her left calf throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with her pulse. She ignored it, grabbing the folded clothes from the box. Denim this time. A pair of stiff dark jeans and a plain grey Henley. They fit better than the sweatpants, though they still hung loose on her hips. She laced up her own boots, still slightly damp, smelling of street sludge and rain, and followed Collins out. The hallway outside was a stark contrast to the sterile cell. It was all exposed brick and heavy steel beams dimly lit by amber sconces. The air smelled of old paper cigar smoke and the distinct dry ozone scent of overheated electronics. Collins stopped in front of a frosted glass door and pushed it open. It wasn't a standard office. It was a nerve center. Racks of servers hummed against the back wall, generating a wall of white noise that vibrated in Sadie's teeth. Wires snaked across the ceiling like black veins. In the center of the room sat a massive steel desk dominated by 4 curved monitors. Ricky was already there. He stood leaning over the desk, reading a printed spreadsheet. He wore a fresh shirt, black this time, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He didn't look up when she walked in. Sit, he commanded, tapping a heavy finger against the desk. Sadie limped over and pulled out the ergonomic mesh chair. She sank into it, the screens casting a pale bluish glow across her bruised face. A sleek black laptop sat closed in front of the monitors. Beside it rested a small encrypted hard drive. The very drive she had nearly died stealing. Victor's money is old, but his laundering methods are new, Ricky said. He finally looked at her. His eyes were sharp, scanning her face, logging the bruise, the stiffness in her posture, before returning to the screens. He uses a network of shell companies tied to offshore logistics firms. We know they exist. We don't know the routing numbers, the passwords, or the holding accounts. That drive has the master key. And if it's encrypted, Sadie asked, her voice raspy, then you break it. Or you guess it. I don't care if you have to pray to whatever god you believe in to crack it. You have 48 hours before Victor realizes he has a leak and moves the funds manually. Sadie stared at the small metal rectangle. $300,000 for her life. Millions of dollars on this drive. The scale of the violence surrounding her suddenly felt suffocating. You're going to bankrupt him, she murmured. I'm going to erase him, Ricky corrected quietly. There was no boast in it. It was a statement of fact, as mundane as predicting the rain. He brought a gun into my office. He threatened my territory. Men like Victor don't learn from warnings. They only learn from amputations. He slid a black folder across the desk. It landed near her keyboard. Those are the known associates. Start cross-referencing. Collins will bring you food. Do not try to access the outside internet. Do not try to send an email. If you attempt to contact your brother, the network will flag it, and I will cut off his fingers before I come down here to deal with you. Sadie's stomach plummeted. Her hands curled into tight fists in her lap, her fingernails biting into her palms. "Leave him out of this!" Ricky leaned down, planting his hands flat on the desk, caging her in. He was so close she could smell the spearmint on his breath, mixed with the dark roast coffee. "He is in this, Sadie. He put you in this. You're bleeding because he couldn't stop throwing dice. Don't defend the anchor that's drowning you." He didn't wait for a reply. He straightened up, turned, and walked out of the room. Sadie sat in the silence of the humming servers. Her chest was tight, a frantic bird trapped behind her ribs. She hated Ricky for the threat. She hated him more because he was right. She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly, and connected the drive to the laptop. The screen flared to life, a blinking cursor demanding a password. She took a deep breath, the dry electric air scraping her lungs. She started typing. Time in the server room dissolved into a singular, agonizing blur of glowing code and alphanumeric sequences. The fluorescent lights overhead offered no clue whether it was noon or midnight. Sadie's eyes burned, feeling like they were coated in fine sand. Her neck screamed in protest, a tight band of tension wrapping from her shoulders to the base of her skull. She had cracked the initial encryption shell 14 hours in. It hadn't been an elegant hack. She had brute-forced a back door through an outdated piece of accounting software Victor's people had foolishly left integrated. But the core ledgers were locked behind a biometric spoofing wall she was currently trying to bypass. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She assumed it was Collins arriving to drop off another bottle of water or a plate of cold sandwiches she wouldn't eat. Instead, the distinct smell of fried garlic-heavy soy sauce and roasted pork cut through the sterile ozone of the room. Her stomach gave a violent, embarrassing lurch. She hadn't eaten anything solid since the afternoon before she ran from Victor's men. A white paper bag landed on the desk beside her keyboard, staining the metal with a faint grease spot. Sadie blinked, dragging her focus away from the cascading numbers on the screen. Ricky stood beside her. He was holding 2 sets of wooden chopsticks. "You haven't moved in 9 hours," he said, pulling up a secondary chair and sitting down heavily. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes deeper, his jaw shadowed with dark stubble. "Your brother is safe, by the way. My men picked him up. He's sitting in a warehouse in Queens drinking cheap beer and complaining about the Wi-Fi." Sadie froze her fingers, hovering over the keys. "You kidnapped him." "I secured him," Ricky replied dryly. He ripped open the paper bag, pulling out 2 white cardboard cartons. He popped the top off one, and steam billowed out. "Victor sent a crew to his apartment 2 hours ago. They kicked the door in and put a few holes in the drywall. If he had been there, they would have taken him to leverage you." Sadie felt the blood drain from her face. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She pushed back from the desk, her breath coming in short, panicked hitches. The reality of the game she was playing crashed over her all at once. She wasn't just typing numbers on a screen, she was moving crosshairs. "Hey!" Ricky's voice was sharp, cutting through the rising static in her ears. She couldn't look at him. She stared at the blank wall, her hand shaking violently. Ricky didn't offer comfort. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was entirely firm, a vice of warm, calloused skin and heavy bone. "Look at me," he ordered. Sadie forced her eyes to meet his. They were as cold and flat as ever, but there was an intensity to them now, a grounding weight. "Panic later," Ricky said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You don't have the luxury of falling apart right now. You are in my house. Your brother is in my house. Victor cannot touch either of you unless I allow it. And I do not allow it. Why?" The word tore out of her throat, ragged and desperate. "Why do you care I'm just a thief, a debt?" "Because I hate messes," Ricky said bluntly. He let go of her wrist, picking up a carton of noodles. "And Victor is making a mess in my city. Now eat. Your brain needs glucose to break that firewall, and I'm tired of listening to your stomach growl." He pushed the second carton toward her along with a pair of chopsticks. Sadie stared at the food. The smell was intoxicating, triggering a primal, ravenous hunger that momentarily overpowered her fear. She picked up the chopsticks, her hands still trembling slightly, and took a bite. It was hot, greasy, and incredibly salty. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence. The only sounds the clacking of chopsticks against cardboard and the relentless hum of the servers. It was an intensely bizarre domesticity. Here she was sharing cheap takeout with a man who could order an execution with a flick of his wrist, hiding from another man who wanted to skin her alive. He's moving it through a shipping front in Rotterdam, Sadie said suddenly, her mouth half full. She swallowed hard, pointing at the third monitor with her chopstick. The money. It's not sitting in offshore accounts. It's tied up in physical cargo, medical supplies, high-end pharmaceuticals. He's buying them cheap from illegal manufacturers in Eastern Europe, shipping them through Rotterdam, and selling them to private clinics here at a massive markup. Ricky stopped eating. He set his carton down slowly, his eyes locking onto the screen. The indifference melted away, replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp focus. Pharmaceuticals? He murmured. Yeah, the ledgers aren't tracking cash. They're tracking container numbers and serial codes. If you want to bankrupt him, you don't drain a bank account. You sink his ships. Ricky stared at the screen for a long time. The silence stretched heavy and electric. When he finally looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitched upwards in a microscopic, dangerous smile. You're a very useful little rat, Sadie. By the end of the third day, the air in the room felt thick enough to chew. Sadie had mapped Victor's entire logistical pipeline. She had handed Ricky the container numbers, the port authorities to bribe, and the routing schedules. She had done exactly what he asked. She had paid her debt in blood and data. But instead of relief, a hollow, sinking dread settled in her gut. She had pulled the pin on a grenade and handed it to a man who enjoyed the explosion. Ricky was pacing behind her. He had been on the phone for 2 hours, speaking in hushed, rapid Russian to men halfway across the world. His voice was a low vibration in the room, tense and violent. He hung up, tossing the burner phone onto the steel desk. It clattered against the metal, a harsh sound that made Sadie flinch. 3 containers secured, Ricky announced to the empty room. He ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it slightly disheveled. It was the first time she had seen him look anything less than perfectly composed. The port authority seized them under suspicion of counterfeit goods. My people are redirecting the cargo. Sadie swiveled her chair around. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her skin pale and waxy from lack of sunlight. So you took his money. Are we done? Is my debt paid? Ricky stopped pacing. He looked down at her. He didn't say yes. Victor won't just let this go, Ricky said softly. He lost $15 million in physical assets today. He knows someone tipped off the Rotterdam authorities, but he doesn't know it was me. He knows you stole the drive. He's stupid, but he can do basic math. Ricky leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. An hour ago, a drive-by shooting took out the front windows of one of my restaurants in Brooklyn. A warning shot. He's lashing out blindly. Sadie felt a cold spike of guilt. Did anyone get hurt? A busboy caught some glass in the shoulder. He'll live. Ricky waved a hand, dismissing the casualty as if it were a spilled drink. But it means the Cold War is over. It's in the streets now. You dragged your people into a war over me, Sadie whispered, horrified. Don't flatter yourself. Ricky snapped. The sudden harshness in his tone felt like a physical slap. I dragged my people into a war over territory and profit. You were just the match. I built the bonfire. He stepped closer, invading her space until she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. The smell of tobacco and ozone clung to his shirt. You don't get to feel guilty, Sadie. He told her, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Guilt is a luxury for people who can afford a conscience. You survived. That's all that matters in this room. I don't want people dying for me. She shot back, pushing herself up from the chair. Her bad leg screamed in protest, but she ignored it, standing toe-to-toe with him. She barely reached his collarbone, but the exhaustion had stripped away her fear, leaving only a brittle defensive anger. "I just wanted to pay off my brother's debt and disappear. I didn't ask to be your weapon." "You begged me to save you!" Ricky roared. The sudden explosion of volume bounced off the concrete walls, deafening in the confined space. Sadie flinched, shrinking back slightly, but she didn't look away. Ricky closed the distance, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. His fingers dug into her muscles, hard enough to bruise. He didn't shake her, but the restrained violence in his touch was terrifying. "You walked into my club, bleeding on my floor, and asked a wolf to protect you from a rabid dog." Ricky hissed his face inches from hers. His eyes were wide, burning with a cold blue fire. "This is what protection looks like. It looks like blood. It looks like collateral damage. If you wanted a clean conscience, you should have let Victor shoot you in the alley." Sadie's breathing turned ragged. She stared into his eyes, looking for any sign of humanity, any flicker of regret. There was none. He was entirely comfortable in the violence. He breathed it. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and furious. She hated him. She hated him for being right. She hated the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, the sudden, overwhelming realization that despite his monstrous nature, this was the safest she had felt in years. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Ricky stared down at her for a long, agonizing second. His chest heaved against hers. The contradiction between them was a physical weight in the room, she a fragile thing trying to hold on to her soul. He a hollow man who had traded his away a long time ago. Slowly his grip loosened. His thumbs brushed briefly, almost imperceptibly, against her collarbones before his hands dropped to his sides. He stepped back, the mask of cold indifference sliding back into place, sealing away the monster beneath a veneer of tailored clothing and cold control. "Pack up the drive," Ricky said, his voice flat, devoid of the fury from a moment ago. "We're moving you. Victor will hit the club next. It's time to go to ground." He turned and walked towards the door. "Where are we going?" Sadie asked to his retreating back. Ricky paused with his hand on the doorknob. He didn't look back. "To my house." Rainwater crawled across the tinted bulletproof glass of the SUV in jagged horizontal lines, pushed backward by the speed of their escape. Sadie kept her forehead pressed against the cold window. The heavy vibrations of the armored chassis hummed through her jaw. The cabin smelled of rich, conditioned leather, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil emanating from Collins, who sat rigid in the passenger seat. Ricky sat beside her in the back. He took up too much space. He didn't sprawl, but his sheer physical density seemed to push all the oxygen out of the cramped interior. He was typing on a backlit tablet, his face bathed in a harsh, clinical glow. He hadn't spoken since they left the club's subterranean garage. Sadie closed her eyes. The adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving a toxic sludge in her veins. Her injured leg throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. She was wearing a monster's clothes, riding in a monster's chariot, speeding toward his lair. The absurdity of it tasted like ash in her mouth. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding men like him, men who viewed people as assets and ledgers. Now her survival depended entirely on his ruthless accounting. "Your brother is already there," Ricky said. Sadie flinched, opening her eyes. He hadn't looked up from the screen. His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying over the drone of the tires on wet asphalt. "Is he hurt?" she asked. Her voice cracked, betraying a fragility she hated. Just his pride. Ricky swiped a finger across the glass. "He tried to throw a punch at one of my guys when they loaded him into the van. They tied his hands with zip ties. He'll survive. You didn't have to tie him up. I don't deal in polite invitations, Sadie." He finally turned his head, the tablet's blue light reflecting in the dead calm of his eyes. "He's a liability. A gambler who owes money to the Bratva and is currently being hunted by a street boss. He is lucky he is sitting in my kitchen and not at the bottom of the East River." She looked away. She couldn't argue. That was the most infuriating thing about Ricky. He stripped away all the emotional fat, leaving only the ugly, skeletal truth of the situation. The SUV slowed, turning off the main highway onto a winding, unlit road, flanked by dense, dripping pines. The city lights bled out behind them, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating darkness. Gravel crunched under the heavy tires. Heavy iron gates parted silently as they approached, swallowing the vehicle into a sprawling private estate. Ricky's house wasn't a home. It was a fortress masquerading as modern architecture. It was built into the side of a cliff overlooking the dark, churning water of the Sound. It was all sharp angles, poured concrete, and massive panes of reinforced glass. It looked cold. It looked completely devoid of human warmth. Collins killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavy and ringing. Ricky pushed his door open and stepped out into the freezing drizzle. He didn't wait for her. He walked toward the massive steel front door, his posture perfectly straight. Collins opened Sadie's door, offering no hand to help her down. She slid out her left leg, buckling slightly as her boot hit the wet pavement. Pain shot up her thigh, a white-hot spike that stole her breath. She gritted her teeth, leaning heavily against the side of the SUV until the wave passed. Inside the house smelled of cedar ozone and emptiness. The foyer was a cavernous space with slate floors that echoed like a crypt. Minimalist furniture sat in rigid arrangements. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. Just a sterile, calculated void. Sadie. The voice cracked down the hallway. Footsteps slapped rapidly against the stone floor. Her brother Liam skidded into the foyer. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his clothes rumpled, and a thin red line circled his wrists where the plastic ties had bitten into the skin. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight, desperate hug. He smelled of stale beer, stale sweat, and sheer terror. "Jesus Sades!" He choked out, burying his face in her shoulder. "What did you do? Who are these people?" Sadie hugged him back, with one arm using the other to keep her balance. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar scent of him ground her. He was a mess, a screw-up who had dragged her into hell, but he was all she had left. "I fixed it, Liam," she whispered. "I fixed the debt." "Touching." Ricky's voice shattered the moment. He stood in the archway of the living room, a crystal decanter in one hand, 2 heavy glasses in the other. He wasn't looking at them with malice, but rather a profound, detached boredom. Liam stiffened, pulling back from Sadie. He stepped in front of her, a pathetic, trembling shield. "You stay away from her." Ricky didn't even blink. He walked to a low slate coffee table and set the glasses down. He poured amber liquid into both, the splashing sound deafening in the quiet room. "You owe the Volkov Syndicate $50,000. Ricky said to Liam, not looking up. "You missed 3 payments. They were going to break your knees tomorrow. Victor was going to kill your sister tonight." He picked up one of the glasses and took a slow sip. "I bought your debt from Volkov an hour ago." Ricky continued, his voice smooth and flat. "And I bought your sister's debt from Victor yesterday, which means, Liam, that you no longer have a gambling problem. You have a Ricky problem." Liam swallowed hard. His bravado evaporated, leaving a terrified boy standing in a man's shoes. "What do you want?" "From you nothing." Ricky's gaze finally flicked to Liam, dismissing him in a fraction of a second. "You're useless to me. You will stay in the guest wing. You will not touch the phones. You will not try to leave. If you do, Collins will put a bullet in your kneecap and drop you outside the gates." Ricky turned his eyes to Sadie. The dismissal vanished. When he looked at her, the room felt smaller, the air thinner. "She, on the other hand, is currently dismantling a financial empire for me," Ricky said softly. "Come here, Sadie." Liam grabbed her arm. "Don't." Sadie looked at her brother's terrified face. Then she looked at Ricky standing perfectly still in his desolate, beautiful cage. She gently peeled Liam's fingers off her sleeve. "It's okay, Liam," she lied. Her voice was remarkably steady. "Go with Collins." She limped past her brother, her boots scuffing against the pristine slate floor. She stopped a few feet from Ricky. He held out the second glass of scotch. She took it. Their fingers didn't brush. "You didn't have to scare him," she said quietly. Fear is the only currency men like him respect. Ricky replied. He turned away from her, walking toward the massive glass wall that looked out over the black, churning water. The rain lashed against it, tiny, violent impacts. "Why did you bring him here?" Sadie asked. "You could have paid his debt and left him in Queens. You brought him here to control me." Ricky took a sip of his drink, his back still to her. The muscles across his broad shoulders shifted under the dark fabric of his shirt. "Victor is a dead man walking," Ricky said, ignoring her accusation entirely. "He lost his money. He lost his cargo. By tomorrow morning his own lieutenants will be looking to cut his throat to appease me. But right now he is a cornered animal. And cornered animals don't calculate odds, they just bite." He turned his head slightly, looking at her reflection in the dark glass. "He knows you're the one who cracked the drive. He knows you're with me. If he wants to hurt me before he dies, he has to take something of mine." Sadie stared at the broad line of his back. The realization settled into her bones, cold and heavy. Something of mine. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a refugee. She was property. A highly valued asset stored in a heavily guarded vault. She raised the glass to her lips. The scotch burned going down, leaving a trail of fire in her empty stomach. "I'm not yours," she whispered to the empty room. Ricky didn't answer. He just watched the rain. The attack came at 3:14 a.m. Sadie was lying rigid on a massive, obscenely soft bed in a guest room that felt like a high-end sensory deprivation tank. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach and lavender. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cascading numbers of Victor's ledgers, followed by the cold, flat void of Ricky's stare. The first sound wasn't a gunshot. It was a deep, resonant thud that shook the floorboards, followed immediately by the screaming mechanical whine of the estate's backup generators kicking in. The lights in her room died, leaving her in absolute suffocating darkness. Sadie sat up, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the glass wall in the hallway outside her door shattered. It didn't break. It exploded, the sound of tearing metal and raining crystal deafening in the quiet house. Automatic gunfire erupted. It was a chaotic, ragged rhythm, far too loud, bouncing off the concrete walls and vibrating in her teeth. Sadie threw herself off the bed, hitting the hardwood floor hard. Her bad leg screamed, but panic drowned out the pain. She scrambled under the heavy oak bed frame, pressing her face against the cold floor. She smelled dust, expensive wood polish, and the sudden acrid stench of cordite drifting under the door gap. Heavy boots pounded past her room, shouting. The sharp, controlled double taps of Collins's suppressed weapon cutting through the chaotic spray of assault rifles. Victor hadn't run. He had spent his last dime buying a suicide squad. The door to her bedroom flew open. Sadie clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down on her own fingers to keep from screaming. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the empty bed. "Check the closet," a rough voice barked. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor. A pair of mud-caked boots stopped inches from where Sadie lay, hidden beneath the bed skirt. She stopped breathing. Her lungs burned. The metallic taste of fear flooded the back of her throat. The man yanked the closet door open, ripping clothes off the hangers. Suddenly a dull, wet sound echoed from the hallway. A heavy body hit the floor. The boots next to Sadie's face pivoted sharply. "Mick," the man called out, his voice tight. He took one step towards the door. Ricky appeared in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore black tactical pants and a tight, dark, long-sleeved shirt. He held a combat knife in his right hand, the blade dripping a thick, dark liquid onto the pristine floor. He didn't say a word. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. The man raised his rifle, but Ricky was already inside his guard. Ricky caught the barrel of the gun with his left hand, shoving it violently towards the ceiling, just as it fired. The burst tore into the plaster above them, showering the room in white dust. Simultaneously, Ricky drove the knife up and under the man's jaw. It wasn't a movie kill. It was messy. It was brutal. The man choked, a horrible, wet, gurgling sound tearing from his throat. He dropped the rifle, his hands flying up to clutch at Ricky's wrist. Ricky didn't flinch. He twisted the blade, stepping back and letting the heavy, dying weight of the man pull the knife free. The body collapsed to the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The smell of copper hit the air, immediately warm, thick, and suffocating, mixing with the chalky dust of the ruined ceiling. Ricky stood over the body, his chest heaving slightly. He wiped the blade on the dead man's thigh. "Sadie," he said. His voice was completely calm, devoid of the adrenaline that was practically vibrating off the walls. "Come out." She crawled out from under the bed, her hands shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. She knelt on the floor, staring at the widening pool of black blood seeping into the hardwood. She couldn't look away from it. It smelled like rusted iron and raw meat. Ricky crouched down in front of her. He didn't touch her. He just placed himself between her and the corpse. "Are you hit?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat felt swollen shut. "Where is Liam?" she finally choked out. "Safe. Collins locked him in the reinforced panic room in the basement when the perimeter alarms tripped." Ricky stood up, offering his left hand to her. His right hand still gripped the knife. "Get up. We have to move. They breached the west wing." Sadie looked at his outstretched hand. It was smeared with the other man's blood. She hesitated, her stomach rolling over on itself. "Sadie." His tone shifted. It wasn't a request. It was the crack of a whip. "Now." She grabbed his wrist, avoiding the blood, and let him pull her to her feet. Her bad leg buckled, but Ricky caught her by the waist, holding her upright with a terrifying, effortless strength. "Walk," he commanded, pulling her out into the hallway. The house was a war zone. The beautiful, sterile architecture had been butchered. Glass littered the floors like diamonds. Bullet holes chewed through the drywall. The air was thick with grey smoke and the smell of sulfur. They moved down the hall, Ricky keeping her tucked behind his shoulder. Every time a shadow moved, his gun, drawn from a holster at his hip, snapped up with robotic precision. They reached the grand staircase. Below them, in the cavernous foyer, 3 of Victor's men were pinned down behind overturned furniture, firing wildly toward the kitchen, where Collins was returning fire. "Stay here." Ricky pushed her behind a heavy concrete pillar at the top of the stairs. Before she could protest, he stepped out into the open. He didn't seek cover. He didn't run. He walked down the stairs calm and upright, raising his weapon. He fired 3 times, 3 sharp, deafening cracks. The chaotic spray of automatic fire below stopped instantly. Sadie peeked around the pillar. The 3 men lay motionless on the slate floor. Ricky stood at the bottom of the stairs, slowly ejecting the magazine and sliding a fresh one into the grip. He didn't even look out of breath. "Clear." Collins' voice rang out from the kitchen. The enforcer stepped over the debris, his face streaked with soot, a bloody gash across his forehead. "They brought a dozen boss. That's all of them inside." "Victor?" Ricky asked, his voice echoing in the dead space. "Front lawn. He didn't come in. He's sitting in an armored Mercedes by the gate. I think he expected his guys to drag her out to him." Ricky looked down at his blood-stained hands, then up the stairs to where Sadie huddled behind the pillar. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding granite. "Bring him to me," Ricky said. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, grey dawn that crept through the shattered windows. The rain had reduced to a miserable drizzle. They dragged Victor into the foyer. He was fighting, screaming obscenities, kicking at Collins, but it was useless. Collins threw him onto the slate floor right in the center of the room, amidst the broken glass and the cooling bodies of his own men. Victor looked pathetic. His expensive silk suit was soaked and smeared with mud. His hair was plastered to his skull. The cheap, rotting fruit smell of his cologne was entirely overwhelmed by the stench of blood and cordite. Sadie stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the concrete pillar. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, bound to the violence she had set in motion. Ricky walked slowly across the foyer. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and methodically wiped the blood from his hands, ignoring Victor entirely, until he was standing directly over him. "You're dead, Ricky!" Victor spat, scrambling backward on his hands and feet until his back hit an overturned chair. "My guys are coming. The whole city is going to burn you to the ground. Your guys are currently carving up your territory, Victor," Ricky said softly, folding the handkerchief and placing it back in his pocket. "I made a few phone calls while you were driving here. I told your lieutenants that whoever brought me your head gets to keep the docks. You have no army, you have no money, you just have a ruined suit and a bad attitude." Victor's face went slack. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The bluster vanished, replaced by a raw, hollow terror. He looked wildly around the room at the bodies at Collins, and finally up the stairs at Sadie. "You—" Victor pointed a trembling finger at her. "You filthy little rat! You caused this!" Ricky moved so fast Sadie didn't even see him draw the weapon. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a monologue. He simply raised the pistol and shot Victor perfectly between the eyes. The sound cracked like thunder inside the house. Victor's head snapped back. He slumped to the floor, instantly devoid of life. A dark pool began to spread rapidly across the pristine slate, mingling with the rainwater leaking through the broken roof. Sadie flinched hard, squeezing her eyes shut. She clamped her hands over her ears, a ragged, terrified sob tearing from her throat. She had survived on the streets for years. She had seen violence. She had seen beatings. But this cold, mechanical execution, the absolute lack of hesitation or remorse, shattered something inside her. The foyer was dead quiet. The only sound was the steady drip-drip of rain and the hum of the backup generators. "Collins, clean this up," Ricky said. His voice was perfectly level. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Sadie shrank back against the wall, sliding down, until she was sitting on the top step, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She couldn't stop shivering. Ricky stopped a few steps below her. He looked up. His face was unreadable. The monster had finished his work, and now he was just a man standing in a ruined house. "He's gone," Ricky said quietly. Sadie looked at him through wet, tangled hair. "You didn't have to kill him like that." "Yes, I did." Ricky climbed the remaining steps until he was standing over her. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. He smelled of smoke, rain, and violence. "I told you, Sadie, men like him don't learn. If I let him live, he spends the rest of his life hunting you, and I do not allow people to take what is mine." Sadie let out a bitter, fractured laugh. Tears spilled over her cheeks, hot and angry. "So I'm safe, but I'm still in a cage. I just traded a cheap thug for a monster in a custom suit." Ricky reached out. He didn't grab her roughly. He didn't hurt her. He gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from her face, his thumb lightly grazing the dark bruise on her cheekbone. His touch was shockingly warm, a stark contradiction to the cold, dead eyes staring into hers. "You owe me $300,000. Ricky whispered, his thumb resting against her jawline. "Your debt is paid. Victor is gone. The ledgers are empty." Sadie froze her breath, catching in her throat. She stared at him, searching for the trick, the hidden clause. "I'm free," she asked the word, tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. Ricky dropped his hand, letting it fall to his side. The warmth of his touch vanished, leaving a cold, phantom ache on her skin. He stood up, towering over her once again. "You can walk out the front door right now," Ricky said. He didn't look at her. He looked out over the ruined foyer, over the bodies and the blood. "Collins will drive you and your brother wherever you want to go. You have your life back, Sadie." He turned away from her, walking slowly down the hallway toward his destroyed office. Sadie sat on the stairs, her heart hammering a confusing, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the blood on the floor. She looked at the open front doors, the cold, grey morning light spilling into the house. Freedom was right there. All she had to do was stand up and walk. She looked back down the dark hallway, watching the broad silhouette of the man who had bought her, used her, and saved her life, slowly disappearing into the shadows. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against her knees. She was free. But as she listened to the slow, heavy footsteps fading away, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She didn't want to leave. Hit that like button if you were on the edge of your seat. Did Sadie make the right choice, or is she just trading one nightmare for another? Let me know your theories down in the comments. I read every single one. If you want to hear more dark, gritty romance and intense mafia stories like this, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who loves a truly morally grey anti-hero. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, monsters always collect their debts.